I mean, I can't believe I'm dreaming need a drink 15 minutes into it.
I need to go. I know, I've got literally dead flies on my glass.
Do you want to stop at the start again?
No, I'm committed. No,
Okay.
Fine, I'll stop.
Hello and welcome to episode 20 of the Wilder podcast. In this episode, we speak with Jan Stannard, who is the founder, trustee and acting CEO of Heal Rewilding. We go on a journey from the initial conception of Heal through to the purchase of their flagship site in Somerset, and we talk about where they are a year on. Hello, Tom.
Hello. God, I can't wait for listeners to enjoy that chat with Janet. I think it's great, and it really is. It's nice to be talking to these flagship, young, new rewilding projects and learning from them.
It's such an interesting conversation because not only do you hear about the journey that Heal have been on, but you also hear about some of the debates that touch on wider issues within the rewilding field.
So before we get into that, there's one quick update on planning, and then there is a cool announcement, I think quite an interesting announcement.
I'm excited.
So the update on planning is there is no update. It's hurry up and wait is a wonderful military term. Still waiting for the end of April decision date. We're just hoping there will be a decision by the end of April and doesn't get delayed any further. But we still are hopeful and confident about that.
Yeah, if we've not been washed away by that point.
I'm not going to talk about weather, just biblical. But the announcement is firstly, I think celebrating your ability to use technology, Chloe.
I'm quite proud of this achievement because that is a phrase we've not heard in this house before.
And building from that success of the volunteers WhatsApp group, we're now converted that into our community WhatsApp group. So, dear listener, if you are enjoying the podcast and you want to be kept abreast of all the comings and goings over at the Grange Project, then in the show note, there will be a link to the community group. We're also going to put out on all the socials as well. And we hope to build a community on WhatsApp, which I think makes sense, especially because we learned that community groups on WhatsApp can actually have separate rooms. So we've got the announcement room that everyone automatically is part of, but then you've got a general chat room. So if you do want to be more engaged with the community, you can request to join that.
There's been some fun updates around trees and some exchange of wildflowers and general banter.
And that's good. And then we've got rooms where what we're hoping to do is invite other rewilding projects to be part of, where they can request volunteers. So the volunteers room, we can inform each other where there's events happening. And if people want to be kind of serial volunteers, of which there are plenty I've learned, then you can join that group. And we're also hoping to have other rooms, again, requested by the community. So one might be wilding advice. I'm not suggesting that we are the experts to give you the wilding advice. We can talk about our experience. But what I've been bowled over by is just the quality of people in this space and these communities that bring together such a breadth of experience and knowledge and passion that invariably there will be quality answers within the group.
So we'll put the link for the group in the show notes.
Yeah, but don't feel like you have to subscribe to every single one of those rooms. I think that's really important. If you don't want spam and just want to be part of, say, the announcement group, which is just Chloe and I sending the odd message when there's a podcast or an interesting thing happening, then you can do that and you can be basically dip in and out depending on your level of enthusiasm.
Absolutely. Do you want to tell the listeners a little bit about where you went yesterday?
Yep, so I've visited a new county in mid Wales that I haven't been to before. It's Radnorshire, and had a wonderful day with a group of very interesting people, including the CEO of Radnorshire Wildlife Trust, who himself said that you probably have never heard of this place before today when you arrive, so he's probably used to giving that speech. But it was great to go there and visit their Wilder Pentwyn, which is about a 250-acre rewilding site, which is, there aren't that many places in Wales that are calling themselves a rewilding site. So it was great to spend time there with members from the National Trust and TNS, which is an amazing Welsh charity looking at driving and increasing the uptake of rewilding within Wales.
And look out for podcast episodes on both Wilder Pentwyn and on TNS.
Yeah. And the reason why we bring this up now is only because during the myriad of conversations, we talked about the belted galloways, and we talked about the ponies, which were really cute and cool, but also we had the pigs there on site, and I got to really see the impact these pigs could have. And it has inspired me to come back, talk to you, Chloe, and I think we've made quite a key decision, haven't we?
We are going to launch Project Pig.
And it didn't take a lot of convincing, and that's Project Pigs, plural.
Yeah.
And we already have one person, part of the community of the podcast, already given us some advice on how to manage these pigs. So we're going to go back to them. But also, listeners, if you've got some advice and help us out with pig husbandry and specifically types of pigs, because we're not looking for huge pigs, are we? We would like...
I think we just need the beginner's guide to pigs.
Medium-sized pig. I'm thinking medium-sized pig.
Okay.
Two of them, probably. So anyway, and that's purely down to the importance and the emphasis on, during that visit, on the importance of using those pigs during the initial stage of a rewilding site to create that significant ground disturbance to set conditions for a wilder project quicker. So
we've sort of felt that your pickaxe hasn't quite been cutting it.
I think it has been doing a fine job, thank you. But I think that we need a bit of support. So that's it. Right, those are all the updates from the Grange Project. And should we get into the interview?
Absolutely.
So here is a wonderful and inspiring conversation with an extremely knowledgeable lady, Jan from Heal Rewilding.
Hello, Jan, and welcome to the Welder podcast. We're so excited to have you on today because you're actually our first larger scale rewilding project we've spoken to you on the podcast. But before we get into the details of the project, it'd be lovely to hear about who you are and kind of how do you find yourself doing what you're doing.
Yes, thank you both, Chloe and Tom, and really pleased to be here talking to you about something which now fills every waking moment and is essentially the best thing I've ever done. So I'm Jan Stannard. I first fell in love with nature when I was very small, always loved it, had a business career, brought up 2 children, and then became increasingly anxious about the state of nature and climate. And began to think as I entered my 60s, I'm quite happy to say that's how old I am now, about how I could make a difference. And that was how the idea of creating an entity which became Heal arose. But nature makes my heart sing.
Oh, that's a lovely start to the podcast, and that really resonates for me. I've just been out on a walk around our project here and the birds are going and it really feels like spring's starting to arrive, so it's really nice to hear that reflection. So you mentioned Heal there. Could you tell us a little bit about Heal and how it came about?
Yes. In about 2018, having read Feral, then Wilding, I realised that for nature to have any chance of recovering, new places for nature needed to be created. And that was the single idea which led to the concept of a charity which we totally dedicated to creating new spaces for nature by raising money, buying land and rewilding it. And it took about 2 years to research it, to work out how we could do it financially, to understand what had made NEP a success. So I'm sure many of your listeners will know NEP, but NEP is one of the best examples of a lowland rewilding site in England. And so it was a lot of research and study coming up the model. And then Heal launched a week into lockdown. But rather than postpone because of lockdown, we just decided to push forward. And by this point, we were a registered charity with 6 trustees. And so we launched and we were absolutely blown away by the reaction to the launch. We had a single story in The Guardian and we were swamped. There were only 2 of us and we were completely swamped. There was clearly this desperate wish to take direct action to create more space for nature. And we've never looked back since.
For those that might be curious, on a top level, why are new spaces for nature important?
The traditional way of protecting nature has been through conservation. And conservation is effectively about taking care of what you have left, making sure that that's looked after. But what new spaces for nature are about is giving nature more room and more new places so that it can expand rather than simply be kept at that certain level. And there were still declines going on when conservation, which is a wonderful sort of fellow approach, fellow movement to the rewilding or nature recovery movement. So without conservation, we wouldn't have what we have left. But what the rewilding approach does is take the idea of new spaces for nature and let those spaces be led by nature. So yes, there is a difference between those 2 approaches.
And if we have these spaces that have been led more by nature, what are the benefits for biodiversity and benefits for people alongside that? What would you describe as the importance of that?
What's important to Heal as a charity is not only to take positive steps towards increasing wildlife abundance and diversity again, but also to share the joy, the benefits of spending time in a natural space with anyone who is able to reach the site and be here for those reasons. So our 3 pillars as a charity are nature recovery, climate action and wellbeing, both for wildlife and people, having more spaces that are accessible. So there are other people working on their land with nature as the beneficiary, but as a charity, our aim is to share that impact with anybody who is able to come. And actually, the recovery of nature is, in my opinion, and generally we share this within the team at Heal, is that only by working together as individuals and businesses will we make the difference that is needed for nature. So it's all about all of us coming together, whether we're individuals with a few pounds or companies with much deeper pockets. And that, when we come together, will help us make the difference and will enable us and other people and organisations to create these new spaces.
So I'm really interested to dig a little bit deeper on how do we engage community in a responsible way. But I will come into that a little bit later on. I just want to take a quick step back, actually, and just better understand Heal, and specifically Heal Somerset. We were very fortunate to be invited by yourself, Jan, down to visit. We had a wonderful day walking around, seeing the site, learning from you and your journey. So can we just elaborate on Heal itself isn't just Heal Somerset. You've got much larger aspirations on that. So it'd be good to hear about your larger aspirations and then niche down to Heal Somerset as your flagship location. And if you could tell us more about that, it'd be great.
Absolutely. The mission that Heal set for itself when we launched in March 2020 was to create a new site for nature in every English county, however long that took. So there are 48 counties. That will go well beyond my lifetime, I feel. Maybe not. But the idea was to create a connected reservoir of a wildlife stronghold in every county and focused on England. So I'll talk quickly to that. There's a lot going on in Scotland, very large areas undergoing rewilding management, and it's a long way from where the trustees of Heal are, which is in the south of England. And Wales, although the charity is registered in England and Wales, we felt needs a Welsh organisation with Welsh speakers, and that England was our natural territory. So it's 48 counties long term, which would be around 25,000 acres of new land for nature over time, and as close as we can to centres of population. And that's not entirely in our gift, because to move on to Heal Somerset, we set out in March 2020 wanting to acquire our first site by the end of 2022. And we looked in 8 counties between Somerset and Kent inclusive for 2.5 years before we found the site in Somerset. So Heal Somerset is a former dairy farm, 460 acres of beautiful undulating countryside with 3 tributaries of the River Frome, heavy, heavy clay. So this year's weather has been punishing because everywhere is so wet. And we have fields that we use for livestock, hedgerows, some of which are quite old, and a very small amount of woodland, a small copse. And it is ecologically depleted land. So that is what we began with a year ago. It was so exciting to move from concept to having a place. And then our second site, we will let this project bed down because it's our blueprint, it's our place to learn for the next site. And we want that to be in the north of England. So it could be Northumberland or Lancashire or Yorkshire to sort of make it a balanced approach. And then the third site, the fourth site, the fifth site could be anywhere in England. But that's the broad approach. We'll aim for them all to be between 400 and 600 acres, for reasons which I could talk about, but it's to do with having large animals back on the land as ecosystem engineers.
Okay, there will be listeners going, yep, cool, I would love to do something similar. But already hearing your years of research and work that's gone into it, and obviously weaving Cohen's experience into it as well, it really sounds simple and isn't necessarily as simple as it sounds. So I'd love to hear the criteria that you had for what you were looking for Heal Somerset. And also, if you wouldn't mind, a little bit of information around kind of how best or how you found the funding for something that is not a cheap asset.
So thinking about the criteria, we had a long list of criteria, and those were generic for all Heal sites. But truth be told, the way that people could think about it is if they decided they wanted to buy the house across the road, they can only buy the house across the road if it comes onto the market. So when we set out in March 2020 with our approach to how we would fund this, we expected the funding to be, or the financing to be, difficult and the finding somewhere to buy to be easy, and it turned out to be the other way around. But there was something operating that was unusual that probably won't be the case in the future, which was there were 4 sort of external significant influences when we began working on this in March 2020. One was Brexit, one was COVID, one was the farmer payout, which the government had announced would happen, but had not specified, and the new way that landowners would be paid, replacing the current basic payment scheme, which anyone who has land can be paid, and with the environmental land management scheme. So at that time, that wasn't settled. So those 4 factors meant that relatively few sites of this size came onto the market in those 8 counties in that 2.5 years. So we looked at very few. I think in the end there were only 4. So it wasn't that we had a huge range of sites to choose from. Fortunately, the site we're at now met quite a lot of the criteria. But one of the things it doesn't meet, for example, is it's not a single block. It's divided into 4 blocks, which is not as good as if it was a single area. But it does have water, which is one of our criteria. It is relatively close. It's within 90 minutes drive of 7.9 million people. We would rather people came by public transport, and the nearest stations, we're in a very rural area, the nearest stations are 20 minutes away. But you have to look at buying what comes onto the market. So I've mentioned now why finding the first project was more difficult than we expected. We wouldn't necessarily expect that to be the case going forwards. The funding and financing, we knew as a new charity that has no wealthy backers, so we literally started with nothing in the bank, that we wouldn't be able to grow to attract enough donations fast enough, given that it's a nature emergency. And we formed a group of financial specialists in the city who were keen on rewilding, who with us reflected on how we could fund something like this as fast as possible, but still make it workable. And the top line on how we've done it is, and how we are doing it is, that we are using 2 different forms of lending plus our own what we call land fund. So until we acquired Heal Somerset, we had amassed and set aside any money that people had donated for land sponsorship. So we have something called Heal 3x3, which is where people can sponsor a 3 metre square for £20 for a 1-year sponsorship, or a lifetime at £100. And then corporates, businesses gave us money for land as well. So we had that set aside, the land fund, but that only got into low 6 figures. But what we had was Direct Line Group, who very, very generously, and I can't reveal the terms, but gave us very advantageous terms for what you could call concessional lending. So they offered us a 3 million facility that we could use to acquire. And then Triodos Bank UK, one of the 2 ethical banks, that and the Co-op, also agreed to be the other lender. So with the 2 lenders and with the land fund, we had enough capital to acquire the site, which was 5.25 million. So it's big numbers, scary stuff, but this is an emergency. And across England, that is the cost of land at a decent scale. So that was how we funded it. And then our goal is to pay off the lending as fast as we can, which is the mission we're doing. So to get more land sponsored, to look for corporate support on land and so on. So that's our model. And plus revenue streams from the site here. So there are lots of ways of, as a charity, of having revenues for a site, and together with land sponsorship donations, that's our pathway to owning the site outright.
Yeah, and when we came to visit, you mentioned, just, and this is going off on a tangent, but I just thought it'd be worth mentioning now, one of the experiences you're developing was it the soundscapes? And it was just amazing. Firstly, just walking around the site and then hearing you talk about the concept for it. So I don't know if you wanted to quickly, briefly talk on that, and then we can actually go back to the questions I've got listed.
No, that's absolutely. We were thinking about ways to engage people and help them to think about nature loss in a different way, because it's very easy to look out over our beautiful site anywhere that's beautiful in this country and see aesthetically a really familiar and pleasing landscape. But if you switch from the visual to the auditory, you then say to yourself, how do the nights sound? And that germ of an idea we worked on for the last 5 or 6 months, which was, if one had been in Somerset in the past, in the recent past, in the ancient past, what kinds of night sounds of wildlife would we have heard? And so we started to research a huge range of wildlife that we knew we had on the site now. Did they call at night? We knew would have been on the site in the recent past and what called at night, and then what was here in the ancient past. So we weren't going any further back than 10,000 years. So we wanted it to be when we could be sure that there were the first people on this landscape, at the same time that there were some of the animals which have now been lost. And this has become an experience of people arrive as the sun is setting. They walk up deep into the site. They come into a performance space, which is around a fire, which puts people back into sort of an ancient space, an ancestral space. And then we set the scene and then begin to play the sounds. It's a composition, but the sounds are authentic. But it isn't just a set of individual sounds. It's been put together as an orchestral piece almost. And it is absolutely magical to sit through. We have 10 performances and test performances as well, and I've probably sat through 6 or 7, and it never fails to thrill because one is under a moonlit sky with the stars out and you're hearing the sounds of all kinds of exciting creatures, some of which have never been heard or haven't been heard for hundreds of years across the Somerset landscape. So it's quite something.
I just love that creativity. That's something I think is really, it is, as we talk about regularly on this podcast, is these creative approaches to how we educate and inform people about it. And that's just a great example of it.
Just to add, one of the points we make as people gather together beforehand is to say to them, you are going to sit in this space and you will not know what a lot of these sounds are. And that is the point, that the ancestors that lived on this land would have known what these were. And we have lost that knowledge. We have become disconnected from those sounds, and the sounds simply aren't there. So the other thing we do is we are silent for a minute, just tuning into the night around us to hear what there is. And it's often utterly silent. We've had tawny owls calling, we've had geese flying over calling. But when you think about all the creatures that could be calling in the 40 minutes or so it takes to go through the soundscape, it really makes a point.
Oh, I think it's an inspired idea. And even since we heard about the event, I've been just taking time when we walk around our land here just to sit and listen, which it sounds such an obvious thing to do, doesn't it? But it's perhaps not something that was naturally I was kind of attuned to. And it's made a big difference in my connection to the land here. So yeah, I think it's a fantastic idea. And I just wish we lived closer so we could come to one of the events, because I think I just sound really magical. Just to take things back to the site itself, there are a couple of things I wanted to pick up on. One, you mentioned one of your criteria is around water. And then you also talked about the heavy clay at Heal Somerset. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about why water is important. And also, when you first arrived on the site in 2023, what were you faced with? Can you give us a kind of verbal description of the visual context?
Absolutely. So let's think about the water to start with. Water is life. And to have water flowing or in ponds or in scrapes, it's a whole different habitat, and it's just the fuel for life. What we really want to see are beavers back on our site, building dams and lodges so that there is natural ecosystem engineering around the wetlands. So making this land wet again was one of the things that we became very aware of when we first arrived and started to look in detail at the land. When we arrived in really early January 2023, the team came onto the site, the small team. What we could see was a landscape that had been where grass had been taken for silage, where we knew that slurry had been put on the land. We knew that it wasn't in any of the stewardship schemes, so there weren't wildflower margins or whatever. We could see very little botany in that first 6 months and through winter and spring and into summer. It was effectively a man-made landscape. So all of the natural species-rich grasslands which would once have been here have gone. They were ploughed up long ago. And the grass which is here is a grass that serves livestock grazing. And then the hedges are obviously scrub, but in man-made form. There was a bit of regenerating scrub, which was really good to see. So last year wasn't as wet as this year, but the land is all drained. So it's artificially drained. And it means that the land could be wetter than it is. This year it is particularly wet, but generally speaking, it's being drained so that the land works for livestock going back onto it. And it means that these little tributaries on the site, when it rains heavily, they rise really fast. They've incised very deep channels. And what we'd love to do is to reconnect the floodplain properly and to make these, they're very young streams. They only rise a mile or two away. They should be much shallower. They should flow out onto the floodplain. The water should be on the land a lot longer. And it's coming off the land in torrents. So with climate change making heavy rainfall events much more likely, it sounds odd, but re-wetting the land, and it is very wet this year, but making this land as wet as it should naturally be is a really key thing. So the lack of botany really struck us, and the lack of trees, because we're in the heart of the Forest of Selwood, which was a 14th century hunting forest, and it was wood pasture, effectively like the New Forest, extending for tens of thousands of acres. And Selwood stands for sallow wood, which is willow. So this is the land of the willow, and we have very, very little willow, and it's very wet, so we should have more willow. So that's a really good example of a change that's happened to the land over time that became very apparent to us in those first few months. But the other thing that really pleased us, and which I think is a surprise to visitors, and it could be something you were surprised by, is that we do have quite a lot of variety of species here, but they're in really small numbers. So we see one of this or two of this or three of this or four of this. We don't see abundance. And that's wonderful because with variety in small numbers, we have the starter populations for that growth to happen on the land. So that was another wonderful realization in those first months after arriving.
This feels like a very familiar story for us because we were kind of on a similar trajectory on our project. So we also acquired the land in 2023 and have observed very similar things here at the Grange Project. But one of the things we've been wrestling with is around baseline surveying. And we don't even have your level of understanding of the botany. Like, I didn't even know what botany meant this time last year. So there's lots of learning that we've been doing. And one of the debates we've been having here is how to make sense and understand of what we currently have and why that's important. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about any kind of baseline surveys that happened at Heal and why they're important.
Yes, so we've done a number of baseline surveys and continuing to do them this year. There could be people listening to this who might want to have their own land. And baselining is just what's here at the beginning. That's all it is. If you get them done in the way that Heal has to do them, because we want to show impact, is will be funding a set of surveys that are done to accepted standards that can be replicated, where the methodologies are consistent, where you can rely on the data, so that when you repeat it at the interval that's recommended, you can then compare like with like. If, on the other hand, you are happy and we were very happy to notice that we've now got 2 barn owls, not 1. We've got 2 short-eared owls this year and there were none last year. We've got 3 kestrels, not 1. So we are seeing, anecdotally, we're seeing evidence, but that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. So we engage with the qualitative, which is the anecdotal observed evidence, but we gather paid-for baselining surveys. And these are not cheap. So they shouldn't be, because you're using professional ecologists and they should be properly rewarded for their skill. The way that we are approaching our baselining, last year we did our carbon baselining and we did our habitat assessments for biodiversity net gain. And then we had some eDNA taken, which is soil sampling, in our case, looking at the life in the soil, which was limited because it's quite costly. And then this year, because you have to make sure it's in the right season and work with the professional ecologists and book them in, we are doing indicator species baselining, which means birds, including breeding birds, bats, and invertebrates. We also want to do hydrology and soil, but at the moment, quite happy to share that the birds, bats, and invertebrate surveys are just shy of £40,000 for 1 year. So that gives people an idea of, and actually what we'd really like to do would cost us about £200,000. So it's good to have the indicator species because they indicate the health of the ecosystem. And we don't expect those results to be great because we're at the beginning. But then we would be, with funding, we would be repeating those at possibly 2-year or 3-year or 5-year intervals. And it's different for each type of survey that you do. But that gives you the gist of it. So the sort of middle way is getting your local reptile and amphibian group to come. They're volunteers. They will be aware of methods of collecting and they may do it for free. So you could, if you use the same group and the same number of volunteers and they survey the same things, then you could potentially compare that year on year without having an investment of funding. But because we want to show impact for our work, then funding that surveying, we are at that end of the spectrum.
I think it's really helpful to think about it as a spectrum, and you want to be able to tell a story, don't you, of impact, and it's what's the rigor needed underneath that story to help kind of give confidence to those findings.
Yes, the survey that we just didn't get organised last year, which I would certainly now pass on as a learning, is get your small mammal survey booked in if you can do it, because that's the biggest change we've seen. And we were told actually by another project up in Derbyshire, Soonart, Rachel Everett's project, that the change in the small mammal population would be immediate because the grass is allowed to grow and then they have shelter and then they can breed profusely as they do as a species. And then you see the birds of prey increase. And those were exactly the things that we saw on a pasture land start. So it's really important if people have arable land or land that's already been allowed to rewild to some degree, they won't see that dramatic change, but we certainly saw that.
Yeah, just like Chloe says, it is wonderful hearing your journey. And although we did have it, about a year ago, the land, we had a tenant farmer on it for the whole of last season. So this is the first proper natural recovery or nature recovery season we've got. So it's nice to be hearing some of your kind of feedback and advice. And I'm just furiously writing down notes to Chloe as you're speaking, going, we need to do that. We've got to get on top of this. Would you be able to give us an it's a year on now, so it'd be wonderful to give us an update as to what the land looks like now. And as part of that, there is always a debate when it comes to nature recovery and rewilding, specifically levels of intervention associated with that. So it'd be good to know the approach you've taken and maybe the approach going forward if you've learned from that as well.
A year in, the main changes we've noticed are how tussocky the fields have become. So we've got these livestock suitable pasture grass species, which are never usually have the chance to grow. So they've grown up and they've flopped over and given this amazing place for invertebrates and small mammals to shelter and breed. The other thing that's very apparent is that docks, thistles and nettles are very present on the land. And those species are amazing for insects. So dock, for example, when it's green, it supports over 40 insect species. And when it's gone over, it can be a home for insects over winter and seeds for birds. Same with the grasses. We saw long-tailed tits and gold crests. I thought my colleague said meant gold finches, but he did mean gold crests, feeding together on the grass seeds that had been left from last year. So I'm convinced that birds particularly are flying over and thinking, oh, that looks really different from other farmland, which probably was cut for silage at the end of the autumn and hasn't grown since. And we can really see it. So our fields look really different from some of our neighbouring fields. And then the other thing we're seeing is regenerating oaks, which was one of the best findings. We had some pairs of volunteers who counted baby oaks in a 5-metre strip in 6 fields. They found 110 new oak trees. And that's part of our way of assessing the impact of the deer we have, because there are quite a lot of deer in the area. But knowing there are 110 baby oaks making a bid for adulthood eventually is really exciting. So regenerating scrub, baby trees, much wetter land because of the rain this year, and profusions of some butterflies. But, we haven't got brimstones yet where we've seen them by now this year, and it's because it's cold and wet. So there are seasonal things that make a difference. So thinking of the intervening and not intervening, these first 2 years, we started by saying the first year, but actually we extended into the second year because you need enough time to get your surveys funded and done. The only intervention was to mow paths for people to walk. So we created a type of habitat because what mowing is a grazing equivalent. So it was like having a sort of set of cows in a row, walking along in a line and mowing these paths. But what we noticed really quickly was that the wildlife on the site were using these paths in preference to the long grass. And you would understand that because they would have to plough through it like we would. So they favoured the paths. So we're talking about fox cubs, badgers, mice, weasels, all those sorts of things. But we haven't had any other interventions. And that's because it's quite an important set of thinking and discussions to alight upon interventions that are needed from a rewilding perspective. So if you're thinking in rewilding terms, your interventions are going to be about repair. So a good example, we haven't made the decision yet, but there probably should be more willows here than there are. That could be something we decide that we actively restore, but with a repair frame in mind. We're not simply saying, let's plant a willow wood. We're saying we're restoring willow, having checked that this was a land of willow, which we haven't yet done. Changing the way that the drainage happens because that's been artificially created. So undoing that work is another restoring, repairing piece of work and intervention towards making the whole ecosystem function again. So the intervention decisions are still under discussion. Some of them need funding, some of them don't. And watch this space, I would say.
Just on intervention, what's your personal perspective on it? The purists will say, well, if it was a willow wood, then insert X number of 100 years' time, it may become it again. But what's your perspective on that? Are you on the side of let it be or more on the side of it's an emergency, maybe we should give it a nudge?
In the middle, I would say. So if we took the emergency, you would proactively plant, restore, really go at it. You would be creating wildflower meadows, you would be planting woodlands, you would be doing that. But we're equally not at land abandonment end of the spectrum, so a very passive approach. It's about where an element of the ecosystem is missing. And the obvious one of those is our ecosystem engineers that are not there. So it's the large animals. And in our case, that is in the future, small herds of cattle only used as ecosystem engineers. We won't be farming them for produce. Possibly ponies, although there is a laminitis question to be considered with experts, and pigs, and the deer are here already. So the animal interventions, some of those are here anyway, the deer, some will be considered for the coming years once the scrub growth has got underway, because one of the learnings from NEP was that reintroducing large animals in too great a number too quickly knocks back that vegetation recovery. So yeah, that's the reason why animals will take some planning time, and you need fencing, which is also got to be funded. Yes, so we're somewhere in the middle. So we would look at repair and it would have to be justified. But if we think nature can do it, then we would let it do it. The one thing I will say is that grassland reversion is something I'm particularly interested in, because you have these effectively artificial grasses. It's not an artificial lawn, but it is not a natural landscape. It's a man-made landscape. So knowing that the reversion will happen in a reasonable time scale is something we're just starting to look at and to consider and to talk to other projects about whether we speed that up by different means. But certainly getting pigs in does help with that.
Yeah, it's really interesting hearing these debates, Jan, because we've been having very similar conversations here. And I think probably because of the size of our project, we're only 80 acres, we're slightly more on the active end. And we had a volunteers day here last week where we had people doing a bit of tree planting and brush pile creation and internal fence removal, which is really fantastic to see some interventions actually occurring on the land, because I think that also helps to engage people and bring people along to see, actually, when I came here before, it was an empty field and now I've left and there are some baby saplings in there, and maybe or maybe not, they will tolerate the conditions. We've tried to pick as native as possible and been thoughtful about where to locate them. But yeah, it was a debate about, do we just leave for natural regeneration, or do we try and nudge nature on its way?
And there is no right answer. And even if somebody disagrees, one picks one's position and is also adaptable, because over time you might, depending on whether we have drought summers or very wet winters, things will move ahead at a different pace. But nature-led means nature-led, but repairing also means that there are some kickstart interventions. And also we have had volunteers taking out internal fences. We have had volunteers helping to keep our brambles under control, but we may decide to do scrub planting, and that's not a decision, but that's something we might look at, but not in lines. We won't be planting hedges because we'll be creating scrub islands if we do it. So There is some, those things are similar, but they're the same habitat, but they're not in human form.
Yeah. Earlier on, you mentioned that one of the main efforts is community engagement, Jan, and I want to move on to that because, it's a challenge that Chloe and I discuss a lot, because we want to open up the land. We want to create permissive paths to allow people to come and enjoy and understand and learn from nature, something, again, that we're lacking quite significantly in Monmouthshire. But then when you start playing through the logic associated with that, and actually people come, and if there's a permissive path, there's going to be quite a few people, and maybe they'll bring their dogs. So do we stop? And dogs obviously can be quite disruptive if in large numbers, and that's bad for nature. So it's this weird cycle that we're currently going through. So I was wondering if A, you've been going through the same cycle, and B, whether or not you've got any insights on that.
We set very early on as a charity that wellbeing and the restorative impact of nature was important to us. So we built into our generic model for sites roughly half the land being closed to the public and half the land being open. And it will depend on the site and how it sort of works on the ground. And here, because we're in blocks, it naturally falls into areas. We have our northern fields, which are closed to the public. They're open to scientists and volunteers and so on. But that land is a real wildlife sanctuary. We don't mow paths there, for example. Whereas in our southern fields, which are 200 acres, and our eastern fields, we have these mown paths. And we're in a rural area. And in our community engagement work we did a year ago, just over a year ago, we decided that it wasn't appropriate for very large numbers of people to be on this site because their roads are very narrow. It's a very rural area, and that we always envisaged that relatively small numbers of people would visit here because there could be other heal sites which are much more about visitors. But we very quickly got engaged with the local GP practice, and we're part of a nature prescribing group in Frome, so that the building of nature formally into people's recovery, primarily for mental health, but also physical health, is something we are already now starting to work on. And you need access for that. So it is keeping the numbers low. Dogs are not allowed anywhere on our site. In the main rewilding areas of our site, we have a small area near the village where we're working with a local village on where the dogs will walk there. But again, we're deciding with the village, co-creating on that. Yes, so dogs aren't allowed because their impact. we don't want large numbers. So an example as well is if you've got corporate groups that want to volunteer, which they do, we say to them always, it won't be large numbers and it won't be frequent. So there'll be small groups working and coming only a few times a year. It won't be 200 people coming onto the site because the impact on the ecology, if that happens regularly, is not something we want to deal with. So it's all about keeping it to smallish numbers.
So Heal Somerset, as we've learned, is still a young site, and there will be people going to the site who maybe haven't been to a rewilding site before and are excited to be, it's like watching Bambi or whatever it might be, or having birds flutter and land on their shoulder, or, all these images that may not be quite accurate. I suppose here's an opportunity for you, Jan, to give us a thing for new people who get involved in wilders. What would they expect when they come and visit the site?
So we love people to visit and people also to volunteer because we have volunteering here. They can come anytime, day or night, apart from a short period over Christmas when the site's closed. And that's really important because if you want to detect bats or listen to very early bird song before dawn, you need to be able to come day and night. So you can come anytime, day or night. But bear in mind what I've said about the soundscape, and bearing in mind we're a year in, this is not about walking around and seeing animals running in front of you. That first of all, it's about noticing the small things, looking at the botany we have, the wildflowers that we have, possibly seeing how few there are and thinking, I'll remember that when I come back. And we have a sightings board in our information station at the start of our Southern Fields area. And you can see this amazing list of sightings. But what one needs to remember is they're there. You may not see them, but they are there. So it's carrying that knowledge with you in your heart and knowing that although you may not see it, just by coming, usually people donate when they come, you are helping to make that story of recovery stronger with every year that passes. So enjoy the feel of the wind, enjoy the sound of it in the leaves, enjoy the river as you hear it run past. Love the really small things. Notice, really stop and notice. Don't just stride through walking and talking. If you stop and notice, you will see more. And there is lots to see. It's small. And with every year that passes, that experience will become richer. So let nature recover in time. Know that it's there. And we'd love people to come to the site and support our work.
Well, I think that is a beautiful note to end on, Jan. So thank you so much for that. I've so appreciated the kind of insights you shared with us during this conversation. And I suppose having kind of listened to this story and having visited the site, I feel so invested in the kind of journey of Heal now, which I think is sometimes the beauty of some of these conversations. And I guess on that note, is there anywhere that you'd want to signpost people to, or how can people get involved that might feel similarly having listened to this conversation?
If you're someone that's listening to this conversation that isn't anywhere near Somerset, but is still keen to help, you might live abroad, donating to us every month or donating from time to time is extremely helpful, no matter how little. Sponsoring a Heal 3x3 square or giving it as a gift is a lovely thing to do. And people can volunteer virtually. So we have desk-based tasks. So joining the group of people who could be anywhere in the world on any time zone, who we might want to do research work with or some project management work with. So there are virtual tasks that we have from time to time. So we have two websites. We have the charities site, which is healrewilding.org.uk, and we have Heal Somerset site, which is healsomerset.org.uk. And there are volunteering opportunities listed on both of those sites, and specifically Heal Somerset. And we also run a WhatsApp group for volunteers as well, which once you had sent in your details, then we would bring you into that group. It's pretty active, and volunteering is a wonderful thing, and people get such joy from it. So there are some of the different ways. And also if you are involved in a business and you want to offer your employees a direct connection to a piece of land, you can sponsor a square in the name of employees, which is called our Employee Square Scheme. And that's becoming very popular with businesses to give their employees a sort of direct connection with nature.
Jan, thank you. We've come to the end. I feel like we could definitely keep going. I've learned a lot, and I've actually been to the site and you showed me around, and I think I feel like I'm even more connected, like Chloe says now. So thank you for your passion. Thank you for the efforts you've gone to make Heal a reality. And thank you again for your experience as well.
Thank you so much.
I loved many things about that interview, but one of them is just the ambition of Heal Rewilding and the real sense of just making it happen, really feeling that urgency, the emergency, and committing to do what it takes to create new spaces for nature.
Yeah, you can see Jan's business brain coming through on every decision. but it's coupled with her passion, which is wonderful, and creativity. We need new brains, new experiences in this industry, in this sector, to become the disruptors, which I think every industry needs if you really want to have a step change in the effect.
And ultimately, we're all working towards that same place of nature recovery and whatever that looks like. And I think it's fantastic. We've got lots of different models that approach it in different ways.
Yeah. And I don't want anyone to listen to any of our chats or even our opinions, anyone's opinions, and go, well, I'm not doing that, therefore I must be doing it wrong. It's like, it's not that at all. It's just embrace and be happy that you're hearing stories about people doing exciting things. Whether they do it your way, their way, or someone else's way, it doesn't actually matter. All that matters is we know that all these people who are doing interesting projects on a small, medium, or large scale are going to leave the places they operate in a better way.
Definitely. And for me, one of the other key takeaways was around the importance of water. And it's something that I have been aware of, but just how Jan explained it. And, you know, we were really lucky, really, when we bought this farm. We didn't have nearly the knowledge that Jan did. We didn't really have a criteria as such, but water is a big feature of here. And I think what's been amazing is watching some videos recently. I watched this really cool one about a wildlife pond and seeing the ecosystem that's created around it. And that's on a very small scale, something anyone can do in their back garden. Maybe we'll put a link to it in the show notes. But ultimately, there's something about water being one of the kick-starting processes alongside disturbance.
That's an interesting point because it has rekindled a conversation I had with Tia Natur over at Grange Wildlife Trust, where I asked them, because I know that they're looking for their flagship project and land to rewild, if they could wave a magic wand, what land would they get? And they kind of paused and thought, and they said it needs to be somewhere at the start of a stream or a tributary that feeds into rivers so that we can demonstrate the value and impact of wilding upstream. That means it's going to hold more water on the land and it's going to help protect downstream. We can demonstrate how we protect humans downstream as well as all the other biodiversity benefits as well.
And it's almost by accident that we've ended up with a very similar setup here at the Grange Project.
Yeah, exactly.
And the final point that really resonated for me, which is something I hadn't thought about in quite the way Jan articulated it, is around the expectations of rewilding projects and how you go with this real hope that you're going to see this abundance of biodiversity and like Jan describes, you know, the eagles swooping, the bunnies gallivanting, well, that's not a word. I don't know what I was trying to say.
Keep going.
Come on, what's the word?
Gallivanting?
That'll do. And actually how you need, in some ways, okay, Tom, now I'm losing my flow, all right?
Keep going.
She talked about that shift in perspective, but actually I think that perspective also needs to come with some understanding of what's happening, the ecological processes in action, to be able to kind of appreciate them if you're not very connected to nature like a lot of people. We are not naturalists. We don't come with that understanding. Therefore, we're expecting to connect with these projects and see the big impact wildlife to have us feel really confident that we are in a wild space. And I think only now would we be able to go and connect with a rewilding project with a slightly different mindset where you can appreciate the diversity of flowers.
There's tussocky grass.
Exactly.
And the value that brings.
Yeah. So then that brings me back to education and how do we help people to understand what they're engaging with and what they're looking at when they're walking around these sites and not just rely on assumed knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, education, I would call it marketing and I would call it signage. There are more creative ways, but signage works. So when you walk to an area on a project and you see a sign and it's looking at tussocky grass, there might be a picture of a tussocky grass, but then a small rodent-y type creature, wouldn't pick the right one, don't know, foal, there we go, and explaining, so this was a very low clipped ryegrass field with sheep on. Now, over the last couple of years, we've had, the grass has grown up, it's gone over, it's become tussocky, and these are the amazing things that are happening beneath that grass, and this is the so what's associated with it every single step of the way. So it's not just tussocky grass with the odd bit of hole in it, it's a whole tapestry of exciting bits of...
It's telling the story of people like us who really didn't understand or still don't really understand what they're looking at so that they can really connect with the value it's bringing.
Yeah. I really want to listen to the soundscape because I just think it would be really spectacular to be able to just imagine what it was like before we just nuked everything and terraformed it to our liking. And it's just, I think it would be a really special thing, an inspiring thing as well.
Yeah, it's a great point, Tom. And it's definitely pushed bioacoustics higher up our list of baseline surveying techniques as well. Not that I really know what bioacoustics are, but we're going to find out and we're going to do it.
Well, now you're all over this technology with our WhatsApp community. And a final plug for that. Okay. In the show notes, click on the link that says WhatsApp community if you want to be part of it. All are welcome. So now you're over technology, maybe I can give you some more technology-based tasking, Chloe.
I'm not sure I'd risk
Right. I mean, we have said this before, but, who knows? Next episode may have answered back from planning.
You never know. To celebrate our 21st episode, maybe.